My wife announced she wanted to date other men at a dinner party in front of everyone. I laughed. She expected me to beg. Instead, I opened my laptop that night and found something that turned her carefully built escape plan into a criminal case. My name is Colin Stafford. I'm 42 years old. I run a small IT company out of Austin, Texas, 12 employees, solid contracts. Nothing flashy, but nothing to be ashamed of either. I built it from a spare bedroom and a second-hand server rack when I was 31. By the time Paige and I got married, it was already turning a real profit. She liked that about me back then. The quiet competence, she called it. Said it was the most attractive thing a man could have. Paige was the CFO of a medtech startup downtown. Sharp as a blade, good with numbers, always the best-dressed person in any room. We met at a networking event 11 years ago. She spilled red wine on my jacket and apologized with such confidence that I forgot to be annoyed. We dated for 2 years, got married, bought a house in the Terrytown neighborhood with a wraparound porch and a backyard big enough for the dog we never got around to adopting. For the first 5 or 6 years, it was good. Not perfect, no marriages, but real. We traveled. We had inside jokes. We disagreed about money sometimes, about how much I reinvested in the business versus what we saved jointly, but we worked through it. That's what you do when you're building something together. Then things shifted. I couldn't tell you exactly when it started. That's the thing about slow erosion. It doesn't announce itself. But looking back now, the signs were there from at least 18 months before everything fell apart. The first thing I noticed was the phone. Paige had always been attached to it. Occupational hazard for someone in her position. But somewhere around the spring of last year, she started keeping it face down on every surface. Counters, nightstands, the coffee table. When it buzzed, she'd glance at it and angle the screen away before I could catch even a word. I told myself it was stress. Startups are brutal, and her company was in a funding cycle. I gave her space. Then there were the late evenings. 2 or 3 nights a week, she'd come home after 8, sometimes closer to 9. Dinner already cold, me on the couch, the TV on, but not really watching anything. She'd kiss my cheek, drop her bag, and disappear into the shower. No detailed explanations. Just long day, or the board wants new projections by Friday. I stopped asking follow-up questions after a while because the answers always felt thin. She started dressing differently, too. New blouses. Heels she hadn't worn since we dated. A perfume I didn't recognize. Something with cedar and something sharp underneath it. I bought her perfume every Christmas because I knew what she liked. This wasn't it. The neighbor across the street, a retired contractor named Doug Pelham who kept odd hours and walked his retriever before sunrise, mentioned something to me one Saturday morning that I couldn't shake. We were both checking our mail, making small talk about the heat, when he scratched the back of his neck and said, almost like he didn't want to, "Hey, just so you know, there's been a car parked on your curb couple mornings a week. Early, like 6:30. Dark gray sedan. Figured it was a work thing." I thanked him and walked back inside. I set the mail on the kitchen counter and stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing. A gray sedan. Paige drove to work at 8:15. A gray sedan at 6 in the morning wasn't a work thing. The second thing that stopped me cold came the same week, almost like the universe was done being subtle. Paige had asked me to grab her insurance card from the filing cabinet. She had a dentist appointment and needed it for the front desk. I found the card. I also found, tucked in a manila folder she'd mislabeled as medical, miscellaneous, a set of documents from her OBGYN. We'd been trying to have kids for 3 years. Or so I thought. She'd gone through the motions, the conversations, the calendar tracking, the occasional sigh about timing and stress. But what I was holding in my hand was a prescription renewal. A contraceptive prescription. Filled 8 months ago. Filled again 4 months after that. I stood in that hallway with the filing cabinet still open and the insurance card in one hand and those papers in the other, and something in my chest went absolutely still. Not anger. Not grief. Just a cold, precise clarity. The kind that arrives when your brain finally stops protecting you from the truth. I put everything back exactly as I found it. I brought her the insurance card. I kissed her on the cheek when she left for the dentist. And I started paying very close attention. I've spent my career building systems designed to detect anomalies. Intrusion attempts, data leaks, behavioral patterns that don't fit the baseline. You train yourself to notice when something is off, Not because you're paranoid, but because ignoring a warning signal costs you more than investigating it. That professional instinct was the same one that kept nudging me in the weeks after I found those prescriptions in the filing cabinet. I didn't confront Paige. Not yet. Confronting someone before you have the full picture is amateur hour. You tip them off, they adjust their behavior, and suddenly the trail goes cold. So I watched. I listened. And I started keeping a mental log. The late evenings continued. 3, sometimes 4 nights a week now. She'd come home with that careful, composed look she wore when she was managing something. The same expression she used in board meetings when the numbers weren't good, but she needed the room to stay calm. I knew that face. I just never expected to see it pointed at me across our own kitchen. The perfume showed up again. Cedar and something sharp. I looked it up one afternoon while she was at work. Described the scent to a fragrance website's search tool and got a match inside of 2 minutes. It was a men's cologne. Transferred scent. I sat with that for a long time before I closed the laptop. Then came Shirley. Paige's mother had been staying with us for 3 weeks, supposedly recovering from a knee replacement she'd had in late February. She was 69, stubborn as old oak, and sharper than most people half her age. I'd always gotten along with Shirley well enough. She was direct, occasionally blunt, and she made exceptional brisket. But during this visit, something was different. She was too careful around me, too deliberate with her words in a way that felt rehearsed. Shirley was not a rehearsed woman. When I walked into a room where she and Paige were talking, the conversation would stop. Not pause, stop. And they'd both look at me with the same slightly too neutral expression. It happened 4 times in 5 days. The 4th time, I excused myself to the back porch and stood in the dark for a while, putting it together. Shirley knew. Whatever was going on, Paige's mother knew about it. That meant it wasn't new, and it wasn't small. I called my sister Tess that Friday evening from my car in the office parking garage. Tess was 40, 2 years younger than me, a high school vice principal with the sharpest instincts of anyone in our family. She listened without interrupting, which, for Tess, was a significant act of restraint. "How long have you been sitting on this?" she asked when I finished. "A few weeks," I told her. "And you haven't said anything to Paige?" "Not yet." There was a pause. "Good," Tess said quietly. "Don't. Not until you know everything." Why I didn't tell Tess, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I'd already started looking. Not aggressively, not yet, but I'd run a passive scan on our home network traffic 3 days earlier. Nothing dramatic. Just a snapshot of device activity and connection timestamps over a 2-week window. What I found was enough to tell me that Paige's work laptop had been communicating with a personal email server between 10 p.m. and midnight on 7 separate occasions. Not her company server. A personal one, registered to a third-party provider that specialized in encrypted correspondence. I didn't dig into the content yet. I wanted to be methodical. Rushing gets you partial answers, and partial answers make you act on incomplete information. I'd seen that destroy cases at work. I wasn't going to let it happen here. What pushed me into the next phase wasn't strategy. It was a Tuesday evening when I came home early from a client meeting that wrapped up an hour ahead of schedule. I pulled into the driveway at 5:40 and noticed immediately that the guest bedroom light was off. Shirley always had the television on by 5. Always. The house felt different. Quieter. I let myself in through the side door and stood in the hallway listening. Muffled voices from the kitchen. Paige's voice first. Low. Fast. The tone she used when she was working through a problem. Then Shirley's. Slower. Steadier. I caught 3 words before they heard the door and went silent. 3 words in Shirley's voice, unmistakably, before he asks. Before he asks. I walked into the kitchen with my jacket still on, set my keys on the counter, and looked at both of them. Paige recovered first, gave me a smile that was technically a smile. Shirley looked at the window. "You're early," Paige said. "Meeting ended," I replied. I looked at Shirley. "How's the knee today, Shirley?" "Better," she said, still not quite meeting my eyes. "Getting there." I nodded, poured myself a glass of water, and told them I had some work to finish upstairs. I climbed to my home office, closed the door, sat down at my desk, and opened my network monitoring software. This time, I went deeper. What I found over the next 2 hours changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. Because it wasn't just messages to a private server. Buried in the metadata of a synced cloud folder page used for work documents was a financial spreadsheet, one I didn't recognize, labeled with an innocuous project code that contained account numbers I'd never seen before and a beneficiary name that wasn't mine. I wrote down every number, every name, every date. Then I picked up my phone and called a forensic accountant I knew through a business contact. A quiet, professional woman named Dana Osgood who didn't ask unnecessary questions. I need to know if money has been moved, I told her, and I need to know where it went. It was a Saturday evening in late April when Paige finally said what she'd been building toward for months. And she chose the worst possible setting to do it, which, in hindsight, tells you everything about where her head was. We were at a dinner party at the home of our friends Kyle and Andrea Fleming. 8 people around a long dining table, good wine, the kind of easy conversation that flows when everyone's known each other long enough to skip the small talk. I'd been quiet most of the evening. Not obviously so. I laughed when it was appropriate, refilled glasses, answered questions. But inside I was carrying everything I'd found over the past 2 weeks like a stone in my chest. Paige had been different all evening. Animated, flushed, like she was running on some private energy source the rest of us didn't have access to. She had 2 glasses of Cabernet before we sat down. By the main course, she was on her 4th. I watched her and said nothing. It was during a lull in conversation, one of those natural pauses where everyone takes a breath and reaches for their glass, that she did it. She set her wine down, turned to face me across the corner of the table, and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Colin, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I want to explore dating other people. I still want us to stay married. I need the freedom to figure some things out." The table went silent. Not the comfortable kind. Carl stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth. Andrea looked at me. The couple across from us, longtime friends named Rob and Jennifer, both stared at the tablecloth. Paige was watching me with an expression I can only describe as expectant, like she was waiting for me to argue, to plead, to ask her what he could do to fix things, like she expected me to fight for her right there in front of everyone. Instead, I laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Not performed. It just came out, a short, genuine sound of disbelief at the sheer audacity of the moment. I set my napkin on the table, leaned back in my chair, and looked at her with the most level gaze I could manage. "You want to date other men," I said, "and you want me to fight to win you back. Is that the idea?" Her expression shifted. Something tightened behind her eyes. "That's not," she started. "Because I'm not going to do that," I continued, keeping my voice calm. "I'm not going to compete for a woman who's already made her choice. That's not strength, Paige. That's just embarrassing yourself." She opened her mouth, closed it. Her face had gone from flushed to something redder. Not wine, not heat. Something closer to the specific color of a person who expected a very different outcome and isn't sure what to do now. I looked around the table, acknowledged our friends with a brief nod, and stood up. "Thank you for dinner," I said to Kyle and Andrea. It was genuinely a good evening up until about 90 seconds ago. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair, shook Kyle's hand, and walked out through the front door into the cool night air. I drove to a hotel on the east side of the city. Nothing fancy, clean, quiet, anonymous. The kind of place where no one expects conversation. I checked in, took the elevator to the 4th floor, and sat on the edge of the bed with my laptop open and the room's one lamp throwing a narrow cone of yellow light across the desk. I wasn't running. I was removing myself from a situation that no longer required my presence, so I could focus on what actually needed to be done. I opened the remote access portal for our home network, the same monitoring infrastructure I'd used professionally for years, installed on our system when I first set it up and never removed. Within 40 minutes, I was inside Paige's sync devices. I wasn't looking for drama. I was looking for documentation. What I found in the photo metadata stopped me cold. The timestamps, the GPS coordinates embedded in images she'd sent from her phone. They placed her at our home address on 4 separate occasions during mornings when I'd been traveling for client work. Not a hotel. Not his place. At her house. I sat very still and looked at those coordinates for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called our furniture company's after-hours line. I left a detailed voicemail requesting a full replacement quote for the living room and bedroom sets, and asked that the invoice be prepared in Paige's name for billing purposes. It wasn't petty. It was the first clean action I could take in a situation that had become very dirty without my knowledge or consent. By 2 in the morning, the hotel room had become something else entirely. I'd pulled the small desk away from the wall, arranged my laptop, phone, and a yellow legal pad in a tight working triangle. And I was moving through Paige's digital footprint with the same systematic focus I brought to any professional audit. What I found in the first hour told me the affair had been going on for at least 5 months. The encrypted personal server she'd been using, the one I'd flagged in the home network traffic 2 weeks earlier, contained message threads saved under a contact name that read P. Langford, vendor. Spencer's last name, as it turned out, was Langford. He was a senior product manager at a competing medtech firm. They'd met at an industry conference in Phoenix 8 months ago. The messages started professional. Within 3 weeks, they were not. I didn't read all of them. I didn't need to. I pulled timestamps, screenshotted key exchanges, cataloged dates, and cross-referenced them against Paige's calendar syncs. The pattern was systematic. Tuesday evenings and some Friday afternoons, always framed in her calendar as client calls or strategy sessions. Then I found the hotel records. 2 separate stays at a property 12 minutes from our house. The first on a Tuesday, 6 weeks ago. The second on a Thursday, 3 days before Paige had canceled a dinner reservation I'd made for our anniversary, citing an emergency board meeting that, according to the company's public filing schedule, hadn't existed. I wrote down both dates, both confirmation numbers, both room totals, charged to a corporate card she managed independently through the startup. The GPS data from the photos was what truly gutted me, though. For mornings while I was traveling, twice to Dallas, once to Denver, once to a 2-day conference in Nashville, Spencer's digital trail put him inside our home, inside the house I'd bought, the rooms I'd renovated on weekends with my own hands. I closed the laptop at 2:45, stood up, and walked to the window. The city outside was quiet. A few lit windows in the building across the street. Headlights moving slowly on the road below. I thought about the version of myself that had walked into that dinner party 6 hours ago, carrying all of this silently, still giving Paige the benefit of a doubt I no longer had any logical reason to extend. That version of me was gone. What replaced it wasn't rage. It was a kind of cold, forward-facing clarity that I recognized from the hardest professional moments of my career. The problem was defined. Now came the solution. I called Dana Osgood at 8 the following morning. She answered on the second ring, unhurried and professional. I've identified unauthorized transfers through a joint account and a secondary account I wasn't fully aware of. I told her, I need a complete forensic picture, where the money went, how much, and whether any of the transactions constitute wire fraud. A brief pause. Send me your documentation. I'll start the trace today. I sent her everything I had by 9:15. Then I showered, put on the same clothes I'd worn to the dinner party, and drove to my office, because the rest of the world still had a Tuesday to get through, and so did I. But the game had changed. Paige just didn't know it yet. Dana Osgood called me on a Wednesday morning, for days after I'd sent her the documentation package. I was sitting at my office desk with the door closed and a cup of coffee going cold beside my keyboard. She didn't waste time on preamble. Mr. Stafford, I've completed the initial trace, she said. You're going to want to take notes. I already had a legal pad open. Go ahead. What she laid out over the next 20 minutes was methodical and, in a strange way, almost impressive, the way a well-engineered fraud usually is, right up until the moment someone with the right tools looks at it directly. Paige had been moving money from our joint savings account in increments small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts. Never more than $6,000 at a time, always spaced at least 12 days apart, always on mornings when I had standing client calls scheduled, which meant she knew my calendar, which meant she'd been planning this while sitting across from me at the breakfast table. Over the course of 7 months, the total came to just under $840,000. The bulk of it had landed in a personal account she'd opened at a credit union across town, listed solely in her name. But it was the secondary transfers that turned this from a painful discovery into a potential criminal matter. 3 payments, totaling $160,000, had been wired from Paige's personal account to a business entity called Langford Vertex Solutions, LLC. Spencer Langford's company, registered 4 months ago in Travis County. Its stated business purpose was technology consulting. Its only client, based on the invoices Dana had pulled through a public records request, was a shell reference, a company name that corresponded to no registered business in any state database. In plain language, Dana said, your wife transferred a significant portion of marital assets to her romantic partner, under the guise of a business transaction. That's not just a civil matter in a divorce proceeding. Depending on how her attorney frames it, this could meet the threshold for wire fraud at the federal level. I wrote that down and underlined it twice. How solid is the documentation? I asked. Solid enough that a forensic accountant would be comfortable presenting it to a federal investigator, she said. The paper trail is clean. She didn't cover her steps particularly well. She relied on the assumption that you weren't looking. That assumption had been her most expensive mistake. I thanked Dana, ended the call, and sat for a moment with my pen tapping slowly against the legal pad. Then I did something I've been preparing for since the previous week. I picked up my personal phone, not my work phone, not a device connected to her home network, and I called Paige. She answered on the third ring, her voice carefully neutral. Colin, I thought we should talk, I said. About the finances. A pause. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds, but enough. What about them? I've been going over the joint account, I said. There are some transfers I don't recognize. I thought maybe you could walk me through them. Another pause. Longer this time. I've been managing some tax reserve allocations. You know how complex our bracket got after the Series B closed. I was going to loop you in. Of course, I said. Can you tell me specifically about the transfers to Langford Vertex Solutions? The 3 payments. Total of $160,000. The silence that followed was different from the others. It had a texture to it. The texture of someone running calculations very fast. That's a vendor relationship, she said finally. Technology consulting for the startup. It went through my discretionary budget. Through our joint savings account, I said. Not the startup's operating account. There was a cash flow issue at the time. It was always meant to be reimbursed. I see, I said. And the other transfers? The ones to your personal account at Loan Star Credit Union. The total that's sitting at just over $800,000. This time she didn't answer at all. Paige, I said quietly. I'm not calling to argue. I just want to make sure I understand the full picture before I talk to my attorney. Your attorney, she said. Her voice had gone very flat. It seemed like the right next step, I said. Given everything. I heard her exhale. And then, in a lower voice, tight with something between calculation and frustration, she said, Colin, if you're thinking about making this adversarial, I want you to understand that I was the one who raised the issue of our relationship first. That has legal implications for how fault is framed. And there it was. I let a brief silence pass. Good to know, I said. I'll pass that along. I ended the call and saved the recording to my encrypted cloud drive. In the state of Texas, recording a call with the consent of one party, yourself, is entirely legal. I was the consenting party. Every word she'd said about the vendor relationship, the tax allocation, the legal implications of who raised the issue first, all of it was now documented audio. She hadn't called an attorney yet when she said that. I could tell by the way she said it. Unpolished, reactive, a tactical move made without counsel, which meant she was still operating under the assumption that she controlled the timeline. She didn't. I did. By the end of that week, the picture was complete. Not comfortable, complete. There's a difference. A complete picture doesn't mean you feel good about what you're looking at. It means you stop being surprised by it. Tess came over to my temporary apartment. I'd moved out of the hotel and into a furnished short-term rental on the south side of the city. On a Thursday evening, with 2 sandwiches and the expression she wore when she already knew the answer to the question she was about to ask. How bad? She said, setting the food on the counter. Comprehensive, I said. I walked her through it. The 7 months of transfers. The LLC. The $160,000 dispenser. The recorded call. She listened with her arms crossed and her jaw set, the way she listened to disciplinary situations at her school, absorbing without reacting until she had the full inventory. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, she said it had legal implications. That she raised the issue first. Correct. Tess shook her head slowly. She was trying to preempt you. Set herself up as the one who proactively disclosed problems in the marriage, so any infidelity claim gets muddied. That's exactly what she was doing, I said. Her attorney, whoever she ends up with, probably would have advised something like that. Except she did it before she had an attorney, and she did it on a recorded line. Tess almost smiled. Almost. And Spencer. I'd spent 2 days building a complete profile of Spencer Langford, and what I found added another layer to the whole thing. He hadn't just materialized at an industry conference 8 months ago. He had a pattern. 3 companies in 5 years, each departure tied to a relationship with a female colleague. Never documented, never formally escalated, always quietly managed. 1 separation agreement, 1 internal transfer to another division, 1 mutual resignation packaged as a restructure. He was good at this. He found ambitious women in high-pressure environments, made them feel understood, and let the relationship run its course until it either served his purposes or stopped doing so. Paige wasn't a love story. She was a target. That information was going in a folder for Spencer's current employer. But not yet. Timing mattered. The thing I hadn't told Tess yet, the thing I was still sitting with, came from a detail buried in a message thread I'd pulled from Paige's sync backup. A reference, casual and brief, to Spencer's wife. Her name was Michelle. She was 37. And according to a comment Paige had made in a message 8 weeks ago, Michelle was 7 months pregnant. I sat with that for a long time before I said anything out loud about it. On one hand, Michelle Langford had done nothing wrong. She was carrying a child and living in a version of her life that hadn't been contaminated by the truth yet. On the other hand, she was building that life on a foundation of lies. And, at some point, the lies were going to collapse whether I was involved or not. I thought about what I would want, in her position. I thought about it for 3 days. Then I had a letter drafted, not by me directly, but through a third-party anonymous mail service I'd used once before for a security disclosure. No accusation, no editorial, just a folder of documentation, timestamps, messages, hotel confirmation numbers. The kind of evidence that speaks without needing a narrator. I sent on a Tuesday. I didn't watch for a response. Whatever happened in the Langford household after that envelope arrived was between Michelle and the man she'd married. I had just made sure she had the information she deserved to have. Tess, when I told her, was quiet for a long moment. "Do you think that was the right call?" she asked. "I think she had the right to know," I said. "What she does with it is her decision. But nobody gets to be kept in the dark about their own life. Not even people we've never met." Tess nodded slowly. She didn't argue. She knew, as well as anyone, what it felt like to be the last person in the room to find out what everyone else already knew. My attorney's name was Robert Hale, 56 years old, former litigation partner, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice because he'd never needed to. He had an office on Congress Avenue with framed diplomas he never mentioned, and a reputation in Austin's legal community that preceded every conversation he entered. I'd met with him twice before Wednesday of that week. He knew everything. The transfers, the LLC, the recorded call, the photo metadata, Dana Osgood's forensic report. He'd reviewed all of it with the same unhurried thoroughness he probably brought to every case. And when he was finished, he'd looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "Mr. Stafford, I want to move on this before she retains counsel and files a counter-narrative. The window is narrow, but it's open." Wednesday morning, Robert filed the divorce petition with Travis County District Court at 9:15. At 9:40, a court order was issued freezing all joint accounts pending equitable distribution review, based on documented evidence of unauthorized asset transfers. Dana Osgood's report was attached as a supporting exhibit. At 10:30, the MedTech startup's HR director received an email. It came from Robert's office. Not anonymous, not informal. A formal legal letter advising the company that their CFO was the subject of an active civil proceeding involving alleged misappropriation of funds, and that relevant documentation had been preserved for potential discovery. The letter made no demands. It simply put the company on notice. By 2 in the afternoon, Paige's badge access had been suspended pending an internal review. I was in my office when my phone rang at 2:47. Paige's number. I let it ring twice, then answered. "What did you do?" Her voice was tight, pressurized. The voice of someone who has just walked into a room and found that every exit has been quietly locked. "I filed for divorce," I said. "And I made sure the joint accounts are protected while the court reviews the asset transfers. You had my access suspended. I notified your employer of an active legal proceeding," I said. What they did with that information was their decision. A pause. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something harder, more deliberate. "I have an attorney. You'll be hearing from her by end of day." "That's fine," I said. "Robert Hale is handling my side. Have her reach out to his office." Another pause. Then, "Colin, we don't have to do this." "Paige," I said, You moved $840,000 out of our joint savings account over 7 months. You transferred $160,000 of it to Spencer Langford's LLC under a fabricated vendor relationship. You were planning to leave before you ever said a word to me about any of it. I kept my voice level, not cold, just clear. We're already doing this. We started doing this the moment you decided I didn't deserve the truth. I heard her exhale. I heard something else underneath it. Not grief exactly, but the specific sound of a person watching a plan they believed was solid start coming apart at every seam. My face isn't the one that should be read here, she said. And the moment she said it, I understood what she'd expected this whole time. She'd expected embarrassment. Mine. She'd imagined me scrambling, competing, trying to win back a woman who'd already checked out. She'd built her entire exit strategy around a version of me that didn't exist anymore. No, I agreed quietly. It isn't. I ended the call. The attorney Paige retained, a woman named Victoria Cross, turned out to have a problem she hadn't anticipated. Robert discovered it within 48 hours. Victoria Cross had represented Kyle Fleming, our mutual friend at whose dinner table Paige had made her announcement, in a business dispute 3 years earlier. Kyle was listed as a potential witness in my proceedings, having been present for Paige's public statement. It was a textbook conflict of interest. Victoria Cross withdrew from the case by Friday afternoon. Paige spent the following week finding new representation. That week cost her. In legal maneuvering, losing your attorney mid-process is the equivalent of losing your footing on an icy road. Everything that follows happens faster than you're prepared for. I didn't gloat. I didn't even allow myself much satisfaction. I just kept moving forward, one documented step at a time. The dossier on Spencer Langford took me 4 days to assemble, and it was one of the cleaner pieces of investigative work I'd done outside of a professional context. I wasn't starting from nothing. I already knew about the 3 companies in 5 years, each departure quiet, each one tied to a relationship with a female colleague that ended badly and was managed away rather than addressed. What I needed was the connective tissue, names, timelines, enough specificity that the pattern was undeniable to anyone who looked at it. 2 of the women weren't hard to find. One had moved to a firm in Denver and had a LinkedIn profile that included a gap in her employment history that aligned precisely with the dates of Spencer's quiet departure from his previous company. The other had left the industry altogether. I didn't contact either of them. That wasn't my place. What I compiled was strictly documentable. HR records accessible through professional licensing databases, separation agreement filings available through county court records, a single civil lawsuit that had been settled quietly and was a matter of public record even if it had never made news. I packaged it carefully. No editorial commentary. No accusation. Just the documented timeline, source-cited, presented with the same clean format I used for client security reports. I sent it to Spencer's current employer, a mid-sized medtech firm with a publicly listed HR director, through a formal email that identified itself as coming from a concerned industry professional. 3 days later, Spencer Langford was placed on administrative leave. I found that out not through any monitoring or investigation, but because Spencer told me himself. He appeared at my apartment door on a Thursday evening, unannounced, unshaven, wearing a jacket that looked like it had been slept in. He looked like a man who had recently watched his life organize itself against him. I opened the door and looked at him without speaking. "I need 5 minutes," he said. His voice had the careful steadiness of someone who'd practiced a speech in the car on the way over. "You've got 1, I said. He exhaled. "I know what you did. With the documentation. The email to HR. He paused. "I'm not here to threaten you. I wanted to say, man to man, that I know I caused damage and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." I studied him for a moment. He was watching me with the expression of a person who was hoping, against reasonable expectation, that a door might open. "Man to man," I said, "you spent months in my house. You were involved with my wife while she transferred marital assets to your business account. And you're standing at my door asking for what, exactly?" Understanding. He didn't answer. "Here's what I'll tell you, man to man," I continued, keeping my voice even. "You made your choices. The consequences that are following you now aren't something I arranged out of spite. They're just what happens when a documented pattern of behavior gets documented one more time. That's all I did." I looked at him for a moment longer. He had nothing left to say, and we both knew it. "Good luck, Spencer," I said, and I closed the door. I stood in the hallway of my apartment for a moment afterward, listening to the sound of his footsteps receding down the corridor. No satisfaction, no residual anger, just the clean, quiet feeling of a chapter that had said everything it needed to say and was now finished. Michelle Langford, I learned secondhand through a mutual industry contact 2 weeks later, had retained a divorce attorney and moved back to her family in San Antonio. She'd had her baby, a girl, reportedly healthy. Whatever came next for her, she was facing it with clear eyes. That mattered to me more than I expected it to. The documents Paige had once kept so carefully hidden were now the architecture of a case that was moving steadily through the courts without her being able to slow it down. She'd built an escape route with precision and patience. What she hadn't built was a contingency for the possibility that I would be looking at the blueprints the whole time. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in late June, 8 weeks after Robert Hale filed the original petition. Travis County Family Court, 3rd floor, Courtroom C. I arrived 20 minutes early in a dark gray suit I hadn't worn since a client presentation 2 years prior, found a seat at the plaintiff's table, and reviewed my notes while the room filled around me. Paige came in with her new attorney, a man named Douglas Farr who'd taken the case after Victoria Cross withdrew. He was competent enough, from what Robert had told me, but he'd inherited a file that was already substantially stacked against his client. He had the look of someone making the best of what he'd been handed. Paige sat down without looking at me. She was dressed carefully, understated, controlled, the image of a professional woman navigating an unfair situation. I noticed the effort in it, the way she'd calibrated everything about her appearance for the specific audience of a judge. Judge Carol Rourke entered at 9:02. 63 years old, 21 years on the bench, a reputation among Austin family law attorneys as someone who read case files thoroughly before she ever sat down and didn't tolerate performances in her courtroom. She settled into her chair, opened the folder in front of her, and scanned the first page without speaking. Then she looked up. "Mr. Farr," she said, "your client has filed a response asserting emotional distress as a mitigating factor in the asset transfer claims. I've read it. I want to address something before we proceed." She set the page down and folded her hands. Emotional distress is a condition. It is not a financial instrument. It does not explain wire transfers to a third-party LLC. Are we clear on that distinction? Douglas Farr said they were clear. Paige a prepared statement. Farr introduced it early in the proceedings. A carefully written account of feeling unseen in the marriage, of seeking connection elsewhere, of making financial decisions under emotional duress. She read portions of it aloud in a voice that was steady but weighted with something that was designed to read as vulnerability. Judge Rourke let her finish. Then she removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench. "Mrs. Stafford," she said, not unkindly but with the precision of someone who had heard every variation of this particular speech, "I understand that marriages deteriorate for complex reasons and that emotional pain is real. I'm not dismissing that. What I am addressing today is the movement of $840,000 from jointly held accounts over a 7-month period, and the subsequent transfer of $160,000 of those dollars to a business entity registered to a third party. Those transactions don't become legally neutral because the person who made them was unhappy. Do you understand the distinction I'm drawing?" The courtroom was very quiet. Paige's jaw tightened fractionally. She said she understood. Robert then introduced the evidence in sequence. Dana Osgood testified as a forensic expert, clear, methodical, unshakable under Farr's cross-examination. The recorded phone call was played in full. When Paige's voice came through the courtroom speaker saying, "The fact that I was the one who raised concerns about our relationship first, that matters, legally," Judge Rourke made a note without changing her expression. The LLC documentation followed. The hotel records. The photo metadata, placing Spencer at our home address. By the time Robert rested, Farr had very little left to work with. He made his arguments carefully and professionally, but arguments built on a weak foundation don't gain structural integrity from the quality of the delivery. Judge Rourke ruled on the asset claims the same day. She awarded me full recovery of the transferred marital assets, directed Paige to liquidate the personal savings account and return the funds to a court-supervised account pending final distribution, and refer the LLC transfer documentation to the Travis County DA's office for review of potential financial fraud statutes. She did not rule on the LLC referral. That was outside her jurisdiction, but she made clear in her language that the transfers were not consistent with any recognized legitimate financial purpose. The divorce decree was finalized 3 weeks later. The house, which I had purchased before our marriage and which had never been properly co-titled due to a documentation error Page had overseen, remained mine entirely. I walked out of the courthouse in a bright July sunlight and stood on the steps for a moment. Robert shook my hand and said we'd done well. I thanked him, and I meant it. Then I walked to my car alone, sat behind the wheel, and let the silence settle around me for a full minute before I started the engine. It wasn't triumph. It was the specific, quiet feeling of a long and difficult piece of work finally being finished. 3 months passed. Austin in early fall is its own particular thing. The heat finally breaking, the evenings coming cooler, the city exhaling after a long summer like it's been holding something in. I noticed it more than usual that year. Maybe because I was paying attention to things I'd stopped noticing during the years. I was focused entirely on holding a crumbling marriage together with steady hands and deliberate ignorance. I'd moved into a new place on the east side of the city, a 2-bedroom in a converted building with exposed brick and tall windows that let in the morning light in a way that the Terrytown house never had. I'd furnished it myself, piece by piece, without compromise or negotiation. The simplicity of that felt significant in ways I hadn't expected. Tess came over on a Saturday afternoon with a bottle of good bourbon and the particular look she wore when she wanted to have a real conversation but wasn't going to force it. We sat on the small balcony, and she let the quiet run for a while before she said, "There's something I've been thinking about since this whole thing started." The way Paige framed it, the open marriage thing, the "I need to explore" language. Do you think she actually believed that was a legitimate choice she was offering you? Or do you think she knew exactly what she was doing? I thought about it honestly. Both, I said. I think she'd convince herself it was a reasonable ask because the alternative, admitting she'd already made a decision and was just managing the exit, required more self-awareness than she wanted to have. But underneath the language, it was a maneuver. She wanted to establish a narrative where she was being honest and open, not deceptive, so that if it ever came to court, she'd position herself as the communicating partner. Tess turned her glass slowly. So the open marriage framing wasn't freedom. It was cover. It was cover, I said, and it nearly worked. Except she said it out loud, in front of witnesses, before she had an attorney. Tess shook her head slowly. That's the part that gets me. The audacity of it. Standing up at Kyle's dinner table and announcing it like she was presenting a quarterly report. She expected me to fall apart, I said. Or beg. That was the calculation. She never considered that I'd already been looking. We were quiet for a while after that, watching the neighborhood below in the early autumn light. The question I hadn't answered out loud, not to Tess, not fully even to myself, was the one about Michelle Langford. Whether sending that letter was right. I'd made the decision, and I stood by it. But standing by a decision and being at peace with every edge of it are different things. Michelle had delivered her daughter, relocated to San Antonio, and filed for divorce from Spencer. Those were facts I knew. What I didn't know, and couldn't know, was what those weeks had cost her, how she processed it, what it had done to a pregnancy that should have been a straightforward joy. I told Tess about it plainly. She listened, and when I finished she said, "You gave her the truth and you let her decide what to do with it. That's all anyone can do." I keep wondering if the timing was wrong. I said. The timing was his, Tess said. Not yours. I let that land. It helped, the way precise things help when you've been carrying something imprecise. Professionally, nothing had changed dramatically. My company had held steady through the whole period. 12 employees who'd never known anything was wrong. Contract that had continued running because I'd built systems that didn't require my constant attention to function. That, at least, was one thing I'd done right. Spencer Langford had been terminated from his position following the internal review. The Travis County DA's office had opened a preliminary inquiry into the LLC transfers. Nothing had been charged yet, but the file was open, which meant the window for accountability was still active. I checked in with Robert Hale periodically. He told me to be patient. I was good at patient. I was at an industry conference in Houston in mid-October. 2 days of panel discussions and networking dinners that I'd almost skipped before deciding that isolation wasn't the same thing as healing. When I found myself in conversation at the evening reception with a woman I hadn't met before. She was composed, direct, with the kind of economy of language that comes from spending years in a field that doesn't reward decoration. We talked for 20 minutes before she mentioned, offhandedly, that she worked in forensic financial investigation. I looked at her. Who do you work for? She named the firm. It was Dana Osgood's firm. I know someone there, I said carefully. She tilted her head slightly. Dana Osgood? Yes. A brief pause. She mentioned your case, she said. Not by name. But the structure of it was distinctive enough that when you said what you do, IT security, Austin, I put it together. She looked at me evenly. She said it was the most methodically documented marital fraud case she'd worked in 11 years. I didn't know what to say to that for a moment. Then I said, I had a good teacher. 12 years of building systems that catch things people don't think they're leaving behind. Her name was Dana's colleague, Priya Merritt, 38, sharp, and apparently unbothered by the particular gravity that trails a man who has recently survived something significant. We talked for another hour. She gave me her card. I held it on the drive back to my hotel that night, turning it over in my fingers in the dark of the back seat, not reading into it, not building anything from it, just acknowledging that the world was still moving, still offering things, and that a man who'd spent a year looking backward might, carefully, without rushing, start learning to look forward again. That felt like enough to work with.